From the lab to your ears, you're listening to WonderLabs.
Hello, and welcome to WonderLabs. This is Chris Richardson, checking in from London, where clubbing has more or less ground to a halt, minus some civilised seated events and illegal warehouse parties and forest raves. It's been a weird year for the scene, as we quickly switched from having multiple clubbing options most nights of the week to a smattering of events at a few venues still able to just about keep things running. Enter Tom Clark, aka T. Fitzgerald, label head at For the Record. I first met Tom a decade ago when he was studying engineering, but his choice of engineering thesis, looking at acoustic treatments to turn abandoned city spaces into music venues, was a taste of things to come. While I've spent much of my last 10 years wandering, he spent much of his honing his craft. Crate digging, throwing parties, and checking out nights. And during that time, For the Record has evolved from a one-man operation to a collective of DJs and producers keeping the beat alive through the lonely lockdown. They've just released their first vinyl-only imprint, A Formal Introduction, with T. Fitzgerald on production duties offering 3 tasty cuts of minimal house and techno. But we shouldn't get fixated on genres. As you'll hear, Tom's way more interested in defining the sound through the experience it creates for the listener, instead of reducing it to a set of sonic characteristics. This isn't your typical WonderLabs episode, but it's also not a sales pitch. It's an exploration of a community that's been close to my heart since moving to London from small-town England many years ago. Frankly, the inability to dance over the last year has been suffocating. Dancing offered at least some respite from the working week. It brought together like-minded people, pulsing together in dim-lit basements, escaping the cold and the rent and the rain. In a society that's increasingly isolated, dancing was one of the few activities around which to build a solid community. So, I'm pleased that close friends are doing their best to keep the dance alive. The volume may be turned down, but as T. Fitzgerald says, the scene will be back in a big way. In this episode, we talk about For the Record, and the journey from playing records in a basement to finally holding your own piece of wax. We discuss the relative value of physical and digital formats, the interplay of music and art, how the scene is adapting to the times, and what we can expect to come next. If you enjoyed what you heard in the jingle, pick up a copy of A Formal Introduction from the usual online stores using the links in the show notes. And without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with T. Fitzgerald. So we're sat in the For the Record home studio right now, and there's an incredible collection of vinyl. It's a very well curated space with foliage and some nice soft afternoon light coming in through the big windows onto the decks. And we're here with Tom Clark, aka T. Fitzgerald from For the Record. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
I feel that I'm really primed for this conversation because I've just spent the morning at the Design Museum at the electronic exhibition, which has just been the most incredible journey through the history of dance music, through from the mad scientists of the early 1900s right through to the software packages that have condensed those huge machines into democratized packages that anyone can use to record music in their own home. So I'm super psyched to chat to you today.
Yeah, great.
So what is For the Record?
So we started back in 2016. Originally it started just with myself, just buying records basically and looking to basically show them online to people, give some more exposure to the artists and labels who were putting this music out that I thought was amazing. And also as a bit of a counter to what was quite common at the time, where a lot of DJs and artists were being quite secretive about the music they were playing. There was a lot of music released under a sort of unknown artist alias almost, not very much information about the music, and also just a lot of DJs playing unreleased music from friends, which there's definitely a place for that, and it's really good to sort of test out new material and that kind of thing. But at the same time, I think it's important to support the music which is in the record shops, on the online shops and stuff. And these are the people who are putting all their time and money into like putting this music out there, and it's important that people see it and hear it and can know what it is, so that they can also go and support these artists and labels. So that was kind of how we started 4 years ago now.
So that was just you doing some crate digging. And what kinds of artists were you stumbling across, and what was that process like in terms of finding the music and finding the artists and connecting with them?
Yeah, so I think around the time it started was a record shop in Paris, Yuyaku. Anyone sort of familiar with house and techno music in general, and perhaps the more kind of like minimal end of it, it's certainly where FTR leans towards. Yuyaku were a really big sort of inspiration in the early days. They were just sort of getting started around that time. They had a number of in-house labels, some of which actually went along with this kind of unknown artist thing. But yeah, just being exposed to a lot of artists' work who they were supporting, and just getting more into the vinyl world, as I came from a sort of digital music background in my earlier years, starting out just buying blank CDs and ripping all my old digital tunes onto the CDs, and sort of still cataloging in some way, and still having some element of restriction that we don't have with like USB sticks, for example, nowadays, where you can have as much music as you want. There's still an element of you've got to select the music you want on a particular CD, right, and then burn it to that CD and put it into your CD wallet, and there's only a finite amount of space in there. And I think sort of, yeah, getting more into like record digging and just the physical restrictions on space that you have with vinyl. It kind of, I don't know, it harked back to my roots a bit more with burning CDs, I guess, and it's obviously a completely different thing, and we'll go more into it, I'm sure. But yeah, Yuyaku were definitely a big sort of inspiration in those early days.
Quick segue on that. I can remember coming home from school, like late 90s, and sitting by a radio with a cassette tape, ready to record, waiting for some of my favourite tracks to be played, or calling into a radio station and trying to get someone to play them, just so I'd have a copy of them on tape.
Yeah.
And then fast forward like a couple of years later, you had, Napster, LimeWire, Kazaa, and all of a sudden you just had this like infinite access to music, and it's kind of been accelerated ever since then.
Yeah, and I think the concept of having a kind of infinite amount of anything means that it loses some of its value. I think that's definitely one of the pitfalls with the digital age, that things become very disposable. We can create as many copies of something as we like. They can all have these kind of minute differences, but ultimately, like, what value do they have if we can have an infinite number of these things, Whereas, yeah, with physical things, it takes more to make them exist in the first place, but once they exist, they kind of hold their value because they are a physical object ultimately, and there's only a certain number of them in the world, and that sort of brings you onto the sort of collector's side of things as well. But yeah, I think this is definitely something which is true of all art forms, certainly not just music.
So how has it evolved from those early days of it just being you searching for music and playing it out there into the void?
So I guess just picking up a few people along the way, really. I've definitely tried to make sure that anyone who does get involved with FTR and what we're doing, we have like a personal relationship rather than just we like the same music. It's important that the people who are involved are kind of behind FTR's values and what it stands for as well. So 4 years on, there's now 4 of us who are sort of spread across the UK, myself in London, another Tom in Bristol, and then Kai and Will down in Brighton. So yeah, kind of over the last 4 years, we started out with just a sort of a podcast every month or so featuring recent releases that we wanted to share and support. And then we've kind of grown from there to now having a couple of radio shows in London and Brighton, which is kind of another avenue where we can sort of put music out there and play music for people. And I guess just on the natural journey, we've started amassing a decent amount of our own music from our own artists and friends. And yeah, I think it just kind of feels like the time is right to to move to the next step and actually create our own imprint where we can put out some of the music that we feel we'd like to have in our collections, and we think other people would like it too, and just support our own artists and friends of FTR.
And what does it actually look like then? So you've got a few people on board, you've got a concept, you've got a set of values, you've got some music behind you. How does that go from being a few people sitting around having a conversation to a piece of wax you can hold in your hand?
So it's a relatively long process. So figuring out the way that you want to go about it, I guess, first of all, whether you want the label to be just vinyl or just digital or both. Given our background and where FTR kind of fits in and what we stand for, it kind of felt very natural that we would just go through vinyl. That's kind of definitely our preferred medium. A lot of it comes back to the point I made earlier about the sort of infinite number of digital things, and that meaning that the thing itself loses its value to some extent. The fact that someone's invested a lot of time and money into making a physical object of like a 12-inch record that then sits on your shelves at home, it's a bit more expensive to buy for the consumer. It means that they have to think about it a bit more. You end up with a more refined collection of music that hopefully is music that you'll love for many years to come. Whereas I think the danger of having a digital equivalent to that has a lower value, and you have no limits on the storage capacity. You just accumulate loads and loads of things.
Right.
But how much do they actually mean to you personally? That's definitely something which I think I've experienced before when I sort of transitioned from just digital to having digital and vinyl to now pretty much only buying vinyl and only playing vinyl. I've definitely noticed a change in how I interact with my own music collection and how I view it. It definitely has more importance to me now, and that's something that I think is a great thing, and definitely something which can be lost if it's a non-physical format.
I have a similar experience as well. I used to save up money and go to the one market stall in the small town that I grew up in that someone would bring records to sell once a week on a Saturday, and I'd go and I'd spend my money on picking up CDs. You take it home, you look at the artwork, you pull out the little booklet, it's got all the lyrics for the songs. You find yourself sitting and following along while you're listening to, well, I guess more lyrically oriented music back then. But that relationship to the record, that relationship to the music, that experience, it's completely different to just being able to log into a streaming service and having this infinite access to any, number of records that are out there. But yeah, that diminishment in value is definitely something that I can relate to.
Absolutely. And I think the personal connection with the record, particularly if you've bought it in a particular record shop, I mean,
yeah,
if I go away to visit another city, anywhere really, I'll always try and find a good local spot to dig through some records. And to be honest, even if it's not a store which has loads of music I like, I always try and make sure that I get something from there, because it marks as a memento and a memory of that trip as well. There's those associations which just can't really exist if you're on Juno download or Beatport or any other kind of digital music provider. Bandcamp is, I would say, has a lot more promise in the sort of digital sphere compared to some of the other platforms, from the point of view that it provides a lot more of a sort of an independent service for the labels and the artists. It's a good way of actually getting the money to go back to the labels and the artists. But yeah, just the personal connection and the physical nature of it is something which means a lot to me. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the artwork as well, because that's definitely also something which is very important and was a big decision that we had to make in sort of working out the plans for our own label, really, because as a small independent label doing a fairly short run of records, paying to have a printed sleeve it's definitely going to knock the numbers out a bit. It's not really something that you can fit within your costs if you're looking to break even or even make money, really. This is definitely a labour of love and not the best thing to do if you're looking to make a few quid, I'll tell you that much.
I'd like to know how the artwork interplays with the music itself. And I know that you've thought about these 3 words to describe the music. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, the three words you're referring to are immersive, hypnotic, and transcendent. And thinking behind that was essentially to try and avoid falling to sort of pigeonholing ourselves by referring to the music or the artwork or any kind of creative decision around the brand, really, in terms of any words which could be associated with other people. We kind of wanted to think in a slightly broader sense. And what is it really that we look for in the music and the records that we buy and the brands that we kind of look to and feel aligned with? So rather than saying this is a label which produces minimal techno and micro house, they're two terms which probably are aligned with like a lot of the music that we're going to release. However, they bring up connotations in other people who are doing those things, and there's certain things you would associate with those terms, and you can easily become sort of pigeonholed into following what other people are doing, I think. So yeah, I wanted to kind of think a bit broader, sort of just dig down into it really, and like why is it that this music resonates with us so much? Like, what is it about it? And that was kind of the journey to coming up with those three words. So the music is fairly stripped back and fairly minimal in its style. I would say to people who aren't familiar with it, the details are quite subtle, and on the surface, perhaps, I mean, people who aren't familiar with electronic music at all might say it's repetitive, it's boring, like these kind of things. But for me anyway, it's about that there's absolutely a hypnotic element in it, and that's coming from both a sort of a music lover's perspective, a production perspective, and a DJ's perspective. It's about, as a listener, getting into some kind of state of trance really, where you get kind of lost in the music, and it allows your mind to just be a bit freer from whatever other worries that people have going on in their lives, and just really get lost in it. That's also where immersive comes in, and transcendent as well to some extent. It's this idea of going into this kind of new space. That's kind of, we're wanting to create a new world, I guess, ultimately, that the listener can get lost in and just have some more like freedom, basically.
And I guess that's as applicable to the internal tinkerings of an individual listener's mind as much as the actual place that they find themselves in while listening to the music. And when I see those three words, when you talk about those three words, to me it feels almost like you can define the music based on the experience for the listener, as opposed to just a descriptor of the music itself.
Exactly, yeah, that sums it up really well, actually. I mean, it's a lot about how you feel when you listen to the music, not really what the music actually is. That's kind of the most important thing, I think. And that's obviously a very subjective thing, and for every person out there in the world, they're gonna feel something different from any piece of music they listen to, and what they feel is going to be different to the person next to them and the person next to them. So I'm absolutely not saying this is something for everyone. This is a fairly like niche end of electronic music, and we're just doing what means so much to us, and just ultimately trying to create a collection of music through the label that is going to stand the test of time, and it's going to move people who listen to it, and it's going to make them feel good. Ultimately, that's the most important thing at the end of the day.
So thinking about those three words, hypnotic, immersive, transcendent, it's very much applicable to the experience that the music evokes in its listeners. How does that translate from the sonic to the visual and the artwork associated with it?
Yeah, so I think we've just done our best to make sure everything is aligned towards those three words, kind of using those three words as a creative filter, if you like, for all these decisions that we make around every aspect of the whole process, really. So yeah, we've also aimed in the artwork to create a design that is striking, but also like sort of in line with these three words. So I feel like it's quite an immersive visual. The other key element of the artwork, I think, is the use of kind of wiggly lines and having things a bit kind of imperfect. I feel like that is another thing which you can sort of translate to the digital versus physical space. Like we live in an imperfect world. Yes, there are like straight lines and things within it, but they normally don't remain straight for very long, and things weather and erode and change over time, and this is the world that we live in, and we live in a solar system which has orbits of planets which are not perfectly circular, and they change over time too. There's all these complex interactions going on. Nothing is purely just like clear cut, and I think that can be something which happens in the digital world a bit too much. We try and make everything perfect, but what actually is perfect, certainly in an artistic context, I don't believe it exists. I would argue that there isn't even such thing as good and bad in an artistic context, and it's all just a thing which evokes an emotional response from someone who's consuming it. I think the other thing on the artwork as well is creating a visual association with a certain label, which is definitely something which I've just experienced it from a consumer's point of view. I think with some of the labels that I follow, which have artwork which has a similar design on each release, there may be changes to some sort of particular details or color schemes or that kind of thing, but you see an image and you immediately associate it with this label that you like. And if you're digging through records in a record shop in particular and doing it in person, then I feel like the artwork is a really big factor in just something that catches your eye, and you've never heard of the label or the artist before, but something about the artwork resonates with you, so you pull it out and you put it into your pile to listen to, and maybe that turns out to be your next favorite record. You just don't know, but having that visual association, I think, is important.
Some of the clubbing experiences I've had in London, going to see a favorite artist playing in a space where a song has been produced with a specific space in mind. Something like Plastic People by Fortet that was produced to be played in Plastic People, which was a dingy, wonky little space with like crooked floorboards and just like a single little red light at the front. Once you've got a record that you're playing out, what's the importance of space in bringing that record to life and giving it a new character?
So I think it would depend on which context I was looking at it through. I think from a DJ's perspective, then the space that you're playing in would certainly have a big impact on the records that you would select to play on a given event. If you look to some extremes, say like Plastic People, as you've mentioned, versus a big open air festival, it's very different sounds which are going to work in like each of those two spaces. I would say most of the music that we kind of follow and that we support is probably more suited to the likes of Plastic People and the sort of the relatively small intimate club environments, rather than the sort of the big outdoor festivals or anything like that. The sounds are refined. There's quite a lot of detail. It's not too like big sounding, if you know what I mean. And really that type of music, if you played it at a massive outdoor festival, like a lot of the detail and the intimacy with it would be lost, really. From the label and the production perspective, I think it's interesting because I wouldn't say that there's a particular space that I have in mind when I'm thinking about what music should be released on the label or not. It's not as if I have this kind of imaginary space in my mind and I have to make sure that the music works in that space for it to fit in the label. It's definitely nothing to that extent. The concept behind it and the filters to make the decisions are much kind of broader, I would say. From a production perspective, I think having a clear concept of what you're trying to make is really important.
Thinking about the different types of experience of clubbing as well, those small spaces, it's not just the music that has that sense of intimacy, it's also the same people that you see again and again popping up, and it creates... The intimate music is reflected by an intimate community and a shared experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And just that sense of community, everyone joining together in a shared experience ultimately, and each person's personal experience of that event is going to be slightly different. But the fact that it's being shared with this community of people is a really, really important thing and cannot be underestimated, I don't think. That's obviously something which has been lost to a very large extent this year, and definitely has highlighted it for a lot of people, like what they're missing, I think. Because obviously we can all like listen to music at home and all the rest of it, but that experience compared to listening to music on a bigger sound system in a particular space, which is designed for listening to that music with other people who are sharing that experience with you, they're worlds apart.
Yeah, and for something to be hypnotic, immersive, and or transcendent, tapping into that ancient tradition of bodies moving rhythmically, synchronized, pulsing together as one giant cohesive unit for hours on end. That's a very special thing, and beyond dance floors and sporting arenas, you don't really have many opportunities to do that in the 21st century. And, you know, as you said, this year, I've been to one of your events, I've been to other events where the scene is trying to adapt and to persist and to survive. And, you know, even if you're sitting down around a table with friends, coming together into the same space to have that shared experience of music and people playing some great records, it's still just about scratching that itch. I'm curious, from your perspective, this experience of lockdown, how has that changed the experience for you as a DJ in terms of being able to read a room and respond and react to your audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely changed it, really. Certainly from the sort of playing out point of view, compared to, say, doing a live stream at home or anything like that. It's just completely different. Obviously, a huge part of DJing is reading the room and identifying sort of connections with the people you're playing music for. And for me, I think it's a lot about trying to learn from them or gauge from them where they're at in terms of how far they're prepared to go with the music, and to try and lead people to discovering things that they wouldn't necessarily discover, or maybe not even like if they heard it out of context. And I think from a DJing point of view, the better you can read the room, you can lead people down a certain path which can expose them to new things that they maybe wouldn't find otherwise. If you're doing a live stream from home, then that just doesn't really exist anymore. Ultimately, you have no visibility on the audience you're playing for. You're kind of just playing music in your own home environment normally, or wherever a live stream has been done from. And it certainly changed the way that I think about what music I'm going to play. I mean, the obvious thing is that you just don't play as much kind of very much dance floor focused music, because there isn't a dance floor. It's kind of to state the obvious. But yeah, I've definitely looked at my collection in a slightly different way. Which records would I kind of listen to in a maybe more of a home listening scenario rather than on a night out? I guess the venues which are doing sort of sit down events are maybe somewhere in between those two worlds. It's definitely something which is a bit new to everyone, and by no means perfect, I would say. I've seen kind of mixed responses to it online as well, and just sort of talking to people about how they find it. Some people are definitely quite against it and feel that if we can't sort of have clubbing experiences we used to, then we shouldn't have it at all, and we shouldn't try and pretend that like we can do something else to replace it. Whereas other people are just kind of fully getting behind it as the best option we have at the moment. I'd say my perspective on that is that I don't see it as anywhere near an equivalent or a replacement to going out and staying up all night in a club and just getting lost in the music on a dance floor in a dark, dimly lit, loud room. That just can't be replaced really without the actual thing itself. What it does offer, though, is the chance to go and listen to music with other people. We can get some of this community feeling back, some of the sort of social aspect of it as well, albeit that we're probably in groups of our own friends and we can't really mingle too much outside of that. It's still kind of better than nothing, if you ask me. And yeah, there's still new amazing music coming out and being released, and the chance to go and play that for people, even if they have to be sat down, is one that we should still take, I think.
What do you think the future has in store for clubbing?
I mean, it's difficult to say at the moment. We kind of don't know what's going to happen next week, never mind next month or next year right now. But it'll be back. I'm confident of that. It will be different in some ways. I'd like to think that it would be different for the better. What that looks like, I don't really know. But I think you've always got to look for the positives in these situations. And I think for a lot of people, what will have really been highlighted is this community aspect that we've been talking about, which has been lost, that maybe people took for granted a bit before, which I think is easy to do in like all sorts of different aspects of life, that suddenly when you can't do something, you realise what you really miss about it. And yeah, we all love the music, absolutely, and that's kind of the main driver and the main connection between the people, but those interhuman relationships are also so important, and without them things just aren't really the same. I think that what's going to be very interesting is the way that this year will perhaps change what music is being produced and released in years to come. I think because people haven't been able to go out and party as we used to, there might be a bit of a shift to potentially slightly more chilled out or alternative music, maybe slightly more suited to home listening, less dance floor focused. That's definitely going to be very interesting to see. I mean, the sort of progressions in the music that's produced and what styles are sort of popular or not as popular is a very cyclical thing anyway, and that's kind of always going round in circles over time. But this year obviously being dramatically different for pretty much everyone in the entire world, kind of all at the same time, surely will have an effect on what art is being made now and will sort of come to light over the coming months and year.
So given that we can't predict the future and where we're going to be at, the most important thing in the meantime is to maintain that sense of community, maintain that sense of shared experience, and indeed supporting your artists and labels so that they can survive and thrive until we come out of the other side.
Absolutely.
A formal introduction, first press for the record.
Yeah, very exciting times. Yeah, that's been the sort of the culmination of this journey that we've been talking about, I guess, and it's going to be really, really nice to, after a lot of hard work and putting a lot of time into it, finally hold our own piece of wax. And yeah, the start of an exciting journey for the label for sure. You'll find the record in all the usual spots.
So before I let you go, we usually wrap up with a quick fire round.
Yeah, let's do it.
Which emerging music genre are you most excited about?
This sort of new breaksy take on minimal.
Is there a track that you recommend people listen to?
I always struggle to pick out one. So on a Romanian producer, Liz, on his LP for Played By, he's got a track, Contrix it's called.
Is there a tool that you use in your work that you're particularly fond of using?
I think my mixer is kind of my baby, really. I've been using the Zone mixers for quite a while now, and just the extra band of EQs and the filters are just, yeah, I just love that thing.
If you could wave a magic wand and shift everybody's collective thinking on something related to music, what would it be?
So the people who are releasing vinyl records and the artists who are putting vinyl records, I would like to see more people actually playing vinyl out. That's definitely a bit of a disconnect, I think, and I think it's something that's probably quite important to keep it in the minds of sort of the younger generation coming through. If they're going out and listening to their favourite DJs and they only ever see USB sticks, then, you know, they're probably not going to be that interested in buying records, even though a lot of the music which is being played from the USB stick is technically a vinyl-only release a lot of the time. So yeah, I think more exposure to seeing the records themselves would be what I would change.
Do you have a music-related fact or joke for us?
Oh, one of the cool things about vinyl, or at least I find it kind of cool anyways, the physical limitations of the medium itself, how the grooves can actually be cut onto a piece of wax so that you get good quality playback, and you've got a restriction on the frequency ranges that you can cut into the grooves. You've got a restriction in time on, you can only have a certain amount of audio in terms of length on one side of a record. But then the sort of new thing that I've learned more recently is the changes to the sound that's produced from the outer edge of the record, where the grooves have a larger diameter, compared to the inside of the record where the grooves have a smaller diameter. And as the diameter gets smaller, the clarity in the higher frequency ranges decreases essentially, which basically means that when you're thinking about putting a record out and where you should put the tracks physically on the record, whether it's on the inside or the outside, whether you've got one or two tracks, these kind of things come into play, and there's these physical limitations and restrictions which come into the decision making. So if you've got a track with a lot of intricacy in the high frequencies, you should keep it on the outside of your record if you want the best sound to come out of it.
Nice. So apart from picking up a copy of A Formal Introduction, what's one thing that everyone should do after listening to this?
Think about how you're consuming art of all forms, whether that's music or otherwise. What does it actually mean to you? What emotion is it bringing up within you? Try and consume things with a lot of thought behind what you're doing, and really think about what it is and who's behind it and who's done it. There's a lot of blind consumption, I think, and we just kind of ingest things without really thinking too much. And I think the more that we think about these things and the more that we support the things that resonate with us, the better.
Tom, all the best with the first release.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's the old jingle, isn't it? Definitely had a science lab in mind.
You recorded the jingle for this show.
I did, way back when, yeah.
It doesn't sound anything like for the record.
No, not quite immersive, hypnotic and transcendent, but different brief, right?
What was the brief?
Oh, good question. I mean, it was definitely quite sort of sciencey. I had school science lab in my mind when I was doing it, I think. When you're talking about places before, that was definitely in my mind. Yeah, I'm not really sure where the sort of slight sort of nursery rhyme melody came from, but there we go.
Thanks for tuning into WonderLabs. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you think might enjoy it. You can also email us at wonderlabspod@gmail.com. This is your host, Chris Richardson. Our brand was designed by Lloyd Preston Allen, and our jingle was produced by T. Fitzgerald at For The Record. You can find more music from For The Record at soundcloud.com/WEAREFTR. Special thanks go out to Liliana Laborde-Dozian. We'll see you next time.